My spoiled sister stole my car, and when I asked for it back, my mother called me selfish for not prioritizing her. I stepped out of the taxi with 3 cardboard boxes stacked in my arms, each one filled with hand-painted Christmas ornaments that still smelled faintly of acrylic sealant and fresh glitter. The November air was crisp against my face, and I could see my breath in small clouds as I balanced the boxes against my hip to dig out money for the driver. The fare was $23, which was $23 I'd have rather spent on supplies. But that was life without a car in a city where public transit didn't quite reach the suburbs where my grandparents lived. My grandmother was already at the door before I'd made it halfway up the driveway, wiping her hands on her floral apron and calling out that I should have let her know I needed a ride. My grandfather appeared behind her with that quiet smile he always wore when I visited, the one that made the corners of his eyes crinkle up in a way that reminded me I was loved even when I felt like a failure. I was 26 years old, running a small ornament business I'd built from nothing but stubbornness and a decent eye for color. And most days I was proud of myself even if nobody else seemed to be. My grandfather reached for the top box before I could protest that I had it handled. He was 73 but still insisted on helping with everything. Still mowed his own lawn and changed his own oil and fixed things around the house without calling a handyman. I'd learned years ago not to fight him on it. We walked up the driveway together, him carrying one box and me juggling the other two, their weight familiar against my chest. I'd packed them carefully that morning, wrapping each ornament in tissue paper, organizing them by design so I'd know exactly what I had when I got to my grandparents' place. We were almost to the porch when he suddenly stopped and looked around the empty street, his gaze sweeping from one end to the other like he was searching for something specific. His eyes landed on the empty spot where I usually parked, the patch of curb right in front of their mailbox that had been mine since I was 21. "Where's your car?" he asked. Simple question. 4 words. Totally reasonable thing to wonder when your granddaughter shows up in a taxi. But my stomach dropped anyway. That sickening lurch that happens when you've been avoiding something and suddenly can't anymore. I opened my mouth to answer, had even started to form the first syllable of a response I hadn't quite figured out yet. But my mother's voice cut through from the porch where she'd materialized like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. Like she'd been standing behind the door listening for my arrival specifically so she could control this conversation. "Oh, that old thing? It's with her sister now. Makes more sense that way," she said, her tone breezy and casual, like she was commenting on the weather or announcing what was for dinner. Like she hadn't just casually referenced the disappearance of my primary means of transportation and livelihood. The silence that followed felt like someone had pressed pause on reality. My grandfather turned to look at me, really look at me, and I saw something shift in his expression. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was definitely some of that. It was more like recognition, like he'd just solved a puzzle he'd been working on for months and didn't particularly like the picture it made. My grandmother's hand froze on the doorknob, her knuckles going white. Even the neighbor's dog, the yappy little terrier that usually barked at everything including wind, stopped mid-yap and fell silent. "Is that right?" my grandfather said. Not a question. A statement that somehow contained an entire interrogation. The way he said it, flat and controlled, was scarier than if he'd started yelling. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up completely, locked tight around words I didn't know how to say. My mother kept talking, filling the silence with explanations that sounded reasonable if you didn't think about them too hard. Something about how my sister needed it more for her career, how she had important meetings and had to look professional, how I worked from home anyway, so what did I really need a car for? How I could always take taxis or public transit, how it all evened out in the end if you looked at the big picture, if you really thought about what was fair for everyone involved. Her voice had that bright, dismissive tone she used when she was rewriting history in real time and daring anyone to contradict her. The tone that made you feel crazy for remembering things differently than she was describing them. The tone that suggested if you argued, you were the unreasonable one. You were the problem. You were making things difficult for no good reason. My grandfather set down the box he was carrying with more care than necessary, placing it on the porch with the kind of deliberate gentleness that felt like the opposite of gentle. The way he moved, slow and controlled and precise, reminded me of how a storm builds on the horizon before it breaks, how the air gets heavy and still, right before everything explodes. He didn't say anything else right then, just picked the box back up and continued into the house, but his silence was louder than words. But I knew that look. I'd seen it once when someone tried to overcharge my grandmother at the mechanic's shop. Something had cracked open that wasn't going to close again. That night at dinner, nobody mentioned the car. Instead, we talked about safe things, neutral things, Things that wouldn't upset anyone or force uncomfortable truths into the open. We discussed the weather, how it was colder than usual for November, and wasn't that going to be hard on my grandmother's roses? We talked about my grandmother's book club, how they were reading some contemporary novel about family secrets and generational trauma, which in retrospect felt a little too on the nose. We talked about my sister's latest social media campaign that had gotten 12,000 likes and was getting her some attention from brands that might want to sponsor her content. I pushed mashed potatoes around my plate with my fork, making patterns in the gravy, and wondered when exactly my life had become something I was too afraid to discuss at family dinners. When had I become someone who just let things happen to her? Someone who sat quietly while her mother rewrote reality and her grandfather looked at her with questions in his eyes that she couldn't answer? Someone who said thank you when her grandmother packed up leftovers she didn't really want because she couldn't afford to turn down free food? The answer, I knew if I was honest with myself, wasn't a single moment. It had been a gradual erosion, a slow giving away of pieces of myself until I woke up one day and realized I'd been running on empty for months, and had stopped noticing because that's just how things were now. That's just how our family worked. That's just what you did when you loved people. The ornament business had started almost by accident when I was 19 and trying to figure out what to do with my life, beyond the vague idea that I should probably go to college even though I had no clear plan or passion. I'd been working a temporary holiday position at a craft store called Riverside Artisan Supply, one of those places that smelled like cinnamon potpourri and sold everything from yarn to wood-burning kits to those weird decorative gourds people put in bowls for some reason. During my lunch breaks, sitting in the cramped break room that always smelled like someone's microwaved fish, I'd started painting the wooden ornament blanks they sold in the store. Just simple designs at first, basic snowflakes and Christmas trees, and stars rendered in acrylic paints I'd buy with my employee discount. Nothing fancy, nothing revolutionary. I'd paint during my 15-minute breaks, during my half-hour lunch, sometimes before my shift started if I got there early enough. But here's the thing about having a good eye for color and a steady hand. People notice. Customers would see me painting and ask questions. Where did I learn to do that? How long had I been painting? Did I take commissions? At first, I thought they were just making conversation, the way people do when they're waiting in line and feeling awkward. But then someone actually asked to buy what I was working on, offered me $20 for an ornament that had cost me maybe $3 in materials, and an hour of time. Within 2 months, I had a waiting list. Not a long one, not something impressive enough to quit my day job over, but enough that I started thinking maybe this could be something more than just a lunch break hobby. Within 6 months, I'd quit the store and was working from my apartment full-time, turning my second bedroom into a workshop that smelled constantly of paint and wood and the particular chemical sweetness of acrylic sealant. I loved everything about it. Loved waking up without an alarm and knowing I got to paint all day. Loved choosing my own projects, my own designs, my own prices. Loved the smell of the workshop, the way paint got under my fingernails and stayed there for days. The focused quiet of working on a detailed piece for hours. Loved delivering orders and seeing people's faces light up when they saw their custom ornaments for the first time. Loved that I was building something that was entirely mine. Something nobody could take credit for or diminish or explain away as luck. By the time I turned 21, I had a solid client base. Teachers who wanted ornaments with their names and year for their classrooms, who'd order 30 at a time and distribute them as gifts. Couples celebrating their first Christmas together who wanted something personalized. Usually their names and a date rendered in careful script. Families who ordered custom pieces every year, adding new members as they grew. Babies and weddings and new houses commemorated in hand-painted wood and careful brushstrokes. Military families who wanted ornaments representing their service. Deployed parents. Homecomings. It wasn't going to make me rich. Most months I cleared maybe $1,800 after expenses, which was enough to cover rent and food and supplies with a little leftover. But it was mine. I'd built it from nothing but determination and a willingness to work 12-hour days when necessary. Nobody had given it to me. Nobody had made it possible except me, and that felt like an accomplishment in a way nothing else ever had. That's when my grandfather showed up with the car. I remember that day so clearly it might as well have happened yesterday instead of 5 years ago. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March, unseasonably warm, one of those early spring days that tricks you into thinking winter is over before it dumps another snowstorm on you. I was in my workshop working on an order of 40 ornaments for a local elementary school when my phone rang with my grandfather's number. "Meet me at the intersection of Oak and Riverside in 20 minutes, he said. "Bring your driver's license." I showed up confused, still wearing my paint-stained jeans and the old sweatshirt I worked in, my hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. My grandfather was waiting next to a 7-year-old sedan, nothing fancy, forest green with some cosmetic dings in the doors but clean and well-maintained. He'd researched the most reliable used models, compared prices, had his mechanic friend check it over not once but twice to make sure everything ran perfectly. He handed me the keys in that parking lot and said, "An artisan needs reliable wheels. Can't build a business from a bus stop." The title was already registered in my name. He'd paid for 6 months of insurance up front. He'd filled the tank with gas and left an emergency kit in the trunk, one of those ones with jumper cables and a first aid kit and a flashlight that actually worked. I'd cried right there in the parking lot. Actual tears streaming down my face, not pretty delicate crying, but ugly, grateful sobbing that probably scared some of the other shoppers walking by. Nobody had ever done something like that for me. Nobody had ever looked at my little business, my weird, non-traditional path, my determination to make a living painting wooden ornaments, and called it real. Called it something worth supporting. Called me an artisan instead of a hobby crafter or a kid who needed to get a real job. The car changed everything. Suddenly, I could go to craft fairs in neighboring cities, could set up booths at festivals and farmers markets within a 100-mile radius. I could buy supplies in bulk from the wholesale place 40 minutes away, saving enough on materials to actually increase my profit margins. I could deliver large orders personally instead of dealing with shipping costs that ate into my already thin bottom line. I could transport finished inventory to stores that wanted to sell my work on consignment. For 2 years, that car was my business partner. I named her Silver because of her forest green paint color that looks silvery in certain lights, which made absolutely no sense, but felt right anyway. I kept her clean, got her oil changed religiously every 3,000 miles, fixed problems immediately instead of letting them deteriorate. I hung a small hand-painted ornament from the rearview mirror, a tiny silver tree that caught the light when I drove. I knew what she represented: freedom, independence, someone believing in me enough to make that belief tangible. But then my mother started talking about fairness and equity and family resources and how we all needed to support each other through difficult times. And the careful balance I'd built started crumbling before I fully realized it was under threat. It began small, like these things always do. Casual requests that seemed completely reasonable on the surface, impossible to refuse without looking like a terrible person. My sister, who still lived with my parents despite being 24 and supposedly building a career, needed to get to an important meeting across town for her influencer work. A potential brand partnership that could really launch her platform. Could she borrow the car for a few hours? Of course, I said yes. Family helps family, right? That's what you do. You don't let your sister miss an important meeting just because you're protective of a car. That would be petty and selfish. Then it was, could my sister keep it for the weekend because she had several events lined up for her social media content, and taking taxis between locations would be expensive and eat into her already tight budget. Could I just use public transit or get rides from friends for a few days? It would really mean a lot to her. Really help her career get off the ground. And her career was still new, still fragile, still finding its footing. She needed extra support right now. Surely I could understand that. Then it was, could my sister just use it during the week since she needed it more than I did anyway? And I could have it on weekends when I needed it for craft fairs and markets? That seemed like a fair compromise, didn't it? Everyone gets what they need. Everyone's happy. Why was I being difficult about this? Except weekends were when I had craft fairs. Weekends were when I made the bulk of my sales, when I connected with customers, when I took custom orders and built relationships that translated into recurring business. Weekends were when my business actually functioned as a business instead of just an expensive hobby. When I tried to explain this, carefully and apologetically, because I'd already internalized the idea that my needs were negotiable, my mother looked at me like I was speaking a different language, like the sounds I was making weren't forming coherent words. "But it's just sitting there during the week," she said, her voice full of confused patience, like she was explaining something obvious to a child who wasn't quite grasping a simple concept. "That's wasteful. Your sister is building a career. She needs to look professional, arrive on time, make impressions. You can work from home." The fact that I worked from home because I'd built a business that allowed me to do so, not because I was unemployed and playing around with arts and crafts like some kind of permanent child, seemed to escape her entirely. Or maybe it didn't escape her at all. Maybe she just didn't think it counted. Didn't think painting ornaments was real work. Didn't think the money I made was real income. Didn't think the life I'd built deserved the same respect as a traditional career path with business cards and meetings and LinkedIn profiles. "It's registered in my name." I said weakly, hating how uncertain I sounded, how apologetic. Like I was the one being unreasonable. Grandpa gave it to me specifically for my business. And you can still use it, my mother said, her tone reasonable and patient and completely unmovable. We're just talking about sharing, being flexible, working together as a family. Families share. They help each other out. They don't hoard resources when other people need them. Don't be selfish. Selfish. That word landed like a physical blow, knocked the air out of my lungs like someone had punched me in the chest. I'd been called selfish before, usually when I said no to something my mother or sister wanted. I'd been called selfish when I moved out at 22 instead of staying home to help with household expenses and provide free labor and emotional support. I'd been called selfish when I chose to build my business instead of getting what my mother called a real job with benefits and a retirement plan and a clear path toward conventional success. So I said yes to sharing the car because saying no made me the villain, and I was so incredibly tired of being painted as the villain, tired of being the problem, tired of having to defend my boundaries like they were unreasonable impositions instead of basic requirements for my business to survive. That was March. By April, my sister had changed the insurance to her name without asking me, without even mentioning it until I got a notification from the insurance company about policy changes. By May, she'd stopped asking permission to use it and just assumed it was hers, would get annoyed if I asked about getting it back for a weekend. By June, when I asked a week in advance if I could please have it for an important craft fair, she told me she had plans, and I should have given her more notice. More notice. For my own car. The car that was registered in my name. The car my grandfather had given me specifically for my business. The car that was supposed to be mine. I took the bus to that craft fair, carried everything in a collapsible wagon I'd bought specifically for this new reality I was living in, made half my usual sales because I couldn't bring my full inventory, couldn't transport the larger pieces, couldn't present the professional setup I'd spent 2 years perfecting, came home exhausted and defeated, my shoulders aching from hauling the wagon up and down stairs and through parking lots. When I mentioned it in the family group chat, trying to be casual about it, trying not to sound like I was complaining, my sister sent a laughing emoji and said maybe I needed to get more organized. Needed to plan better, needed to work smarter, not harder. My father sent a thumbs up to her message. Not to mine, to hers. He was always doing that, acknowledging whatever the last person said without actually contributing an opinion. It was his way of being present without taking a side, without risking conflict, without having to actually engage with the uncomfortable reality that his family was falling apart, and he was letting it happen through strategic silence and carefully deployed emojis. I stared at that thumbs up for a long time, sitting in my workshop surrounded by unpacked inventory and a wagon that smelled like bus station and defeat. And I told myself it was fine. Everything was fine. This was just temporary. Things would get better. I just needed to be patient, needed to be understanding, needed to remember that families helped each other, and sometimes that meant sacrifice. The thing about financial abuse, and I can call it that now even though it took me months to accept the term, months to stop flinching away from language that felt too dramatic for what was happening to me, is that it doesn't start with someone emptying your bank account while you sleep. It doesn't start with dramatic theft or obvious crime. It starts with small asks that seem completely reasonable on the surface. Requests you can't refuse without looking like a bad person. Situations where saying no feels impossible because it would make you the problem, the difficult one, the selfish one who doesn't understand what family means. It starts with guilt and obligation and the weaponization of love. It starts with you saying yes because saying no has been made to feel like a moral failing, like evidence that you don't care enough, don't love enough, aren't enough. And by the time you realize what's happening, you're so deep in the pattern that extracting yourself feels impossible. Feels like it would tear apart everything you thought you knew about your family and your place in it. After the car came the credit card. That happened in July, on a Wednesday evening when I was working late in my workshop, trying to finish an order before the deadline. My mother called, and her voice had that tight, stressed quality that immediately made my stomach clench with anxiety. She was behind on the mortgage, she said. Just 1 month, just a temporary thing. My father's commission check had been delayed, or maybe it was smaller than expected. I got 2 different explanations in the same conversation, which should have been a red flag but wasn't because I was too busy feeling sorry for her to notice the inconsistency. She just needed a bridge loan, she said. Just something to get her through to the next paycheck. Could I help? She'd pay me back within 2 weeks, absolutely guaranteed, the moment my father's next check came through. She'd never asked me for money before. Well, not seriously, not like this. Didn't that mean something? Didn't that prove this was a real emergency and not just her being irresponsible? I had $3,400 in my savings account, money I'd been building slowly and carefully, putting away 100 here, 200 there from each sale. I'd been dreaming of maybe renting a small retail space for the holiday season, somewhere with foot traffic and good visibility, somewhere I could actually have customers walk in and browse instead of relying on online sales and craft fairs. Those savings represented months of careful planning and disciplined saving and calculated hope. I sent her $2,000 and told myself I was doing the right thing. I was being a good daughter. Families help each other when things get hard. That's what you do. That's what love looks like. Sacrifice and support, and putting other people's needs before your own wants. The retail space would still be there next year. My mother needed help now. 3 weeks later, she asked for help with utilities. $500, she said. The commission check had definitely come through this time. She could show me the deposit if I wanted to see it, but it had gone to catch up the mortgage like they'd agreed, and now the electric bill was past due. Late fees were adding up. They were going to shut off the power if she didn't pay by Friday. Did I want my parents sitting in the dark? Did I want them to lose the house? I sent $300 because that's what I could spare without completely emptying my account. She called me generous and loving and the only one in the family who really understood how hard things were, how much they were struggling, how scary it was to be behind on bills. I felt warm and needed and important. Look at me, helping my family through a rough patch. Look at me being useful, being valuable, being the kind of person who showed up when things got hard. Look at me earning my place in this family through financial contribution. It felt good being needed like that. It felt like finally, I was good enough. Finally, I was the daughter they could be proud of instead of the weird one who painted ornaments instead of getting a real job. Maybe I was making up for all the times I'd disappointed them, all the ways I'd failed to be what they wanted. Maybe this was how I proved I belonged. August brought a new request. She needed a credit card, just for emergencies. Something for gas or groceries if money got tight. She'd pay it off every month, she promised. I'd barely have to think about it. And I qualified for better rates than she did, so really, I'd be helping her save money in the long run. I should have said no. I can see that so clearly now, looking back. But in the moment, with her voice plaintive and tired on the phone, with the weight of being a good daughter pressing down on me, I said yes. I added her as an authorized user on my business credit card, the one I used for supply purchases, and I set the limit at $1,000. Just for emergencies, I told myself. Just to help out. The first month, she charged $700. Art supplies, she said when I asked. She'd bought materials for me wholesale, found a great deal, wanted to surprise me. I checked my storage space and found nothing new. When I brought this up, she got defensive. Maybe it hadn't arrived yet. Maybe she'd gotten the delivery date wrong. Why was I accusing her of lying? I apologized. Can you believe that? I apologized for asking about $700 of charges on my own credit card. September was worse. $1,200. The limit I'd set had somehow been increased, though I never authorized it. I called the credit card company and learned that authorized users could request limit increases if the primary cardholder had good credit, which I did, which I'd spent years building, paying every bill on time, keeping my balances low, being responsible. When I confronted my mother about the charges, she sent me screenshots of restaurant meals, gas station receipts, a payment to a marketing consultant my sister had hired. Family investments, she called them. My sister's influencer career was about to take off, she said, and we all needed to support each other through the growth phase. Once my sister started making real money, everyone would benefit. I just needed to be patient and supportive. But I didn't agree to pay for her marketing consultant, I said. Don't you want your sister to succeed? My mother asked. Or are you jealous? Jealous. Another word that made me feel small and petty and wrong. I wasn't jealous. I was confused and scared and starting to realize that my bank account was evaporating while my family's lifestyle remained unchanged. But admitting that felt like admitting I didn't love them enough, didn't trust them enough, wasn't generous enough. So I made the minimum payment on the credit card and told myself things would get better soon. October was when everything crystallized into sharp, undeniable focus. I woke up to a notification on my phone. Insufficient funds. A payment for my workshop rent had bounced. I stared at the screen for a full minute, not understanding. I'd had money. I'd been careful. I'd been tracking my expenses and my income, and everything should have been fine. I opened my banking app with shaking hands. My checking account showed $73.19. My savings account, the one I'd been rebuilding after helping my mother, showed $205. The credit card showed a balance of $4,317. $4,317. I sat there in my workshop at 4 in the morning, paint-stained hands clutching my phone, and felt something break inside me. Not my heart, my denial. I pulled up my credit card statements and started making a list. Started in March, when everything began. By the time dawn broke through my window, I had a spreadsheet that told a story I hadn't wanted to see. $8,243. That's how much had disappeared between March and October. That's how much of my business, my savings, my future had been redirected to fund my family's lifestyle, while they called it love and generosity and family support. The supply charges my mother claimed to have bought me never existed. The emergency gas money? My sister's car, not hers. The grocery charges? I pulled up the dates and cross-referenced them with my sister's social media posts. Dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown. Brunch with friends at a place that charged $17 for avocado toast. Coffee dates and shopping trips and subscription services I didn't even know existed. My mother had created a group chat in September called Family Business Ideas. I'd ignored most of it because I was busy actually running a business. But that night, sitting in my workshop with my cold coffee and my spreadsheets, I scrolled through it. She'd written a detailed proposal for reorganizing my ornament business as a family venture. In her vision, she'd handle finances and marketing, my sister would manage social media and customer relations, and I'd do the actual painting. The profit split she'd proposed gave me 20%. 20% of my own business. The business I'd built from nothing. The business that existed before any of them paid attention to it. There was more. My father had seen the proposal, hadn't objected, had just sent a thumbs-up emoji. My sister had added heart emojis and commented that this was going to be amazing for her brand. Nobody had asked me. Nobody had thought maybe the person who actually created and ran the business should be consulted before they divided up her life's work. I sat on the floor of my workshop that night, the cold concrete seeping through my jeans, and I didn't cry. I was past crying. I was in that strange, clear space beyond anger or sadness where you finally see the truth, and you can't look away anymore. My family wasn't helping me. They were consuming me. And they'd convinced me to call it love. I didn't sleep that night. I printed out every statement, highlighted every charge, created a timeline that showed exactly how the exploitation had escalated. By 8 in the morning, I had documentation that would make an accountant proud. I also had a decision to make. I could keep going like this, pretending everything was fine, hoping things would somehow get better on their own. I could keep being the good daughter who said yes to everything, who absorbed every cost, who shrank herself smaller and smaller until there was nothing left but an overdraft notice and a family that couldn't understand why I'd stopped painting. Or I could ask for help. My hand shook as I dialed my grandfather's number. He answered on the second ring, voice alert despite the early hour. "I need to talk to you," I said. "And I think I need a lawyer." "Come over now," he said. "I'll put coffee on." When I arrived at my grandparents' house, my grandfather was waiting at the kitchen table with his yellow legal pad and his reading glasses, and the expression of a man who'd been expecting this conversation for months. Next to him was a shoebox labeled financial documents in my grandmother's neat handwriting. "How long have you known?" I asked. "Since the night you came for dinner and couldn't answer when I asked about your car," he said. "Your grandmother and I have been watching, waiting for you to be ready to talk about it." The shoebox contained copies of the title for my car, still in my name, printed screenshots of text messages between my mother and sister that my grandmother had saved from my sister's phone during a family gathering, messages planning how to ask me for money and which story would work best. A ledger where my grandmother had been tracking every request for money I'd mentioned in passing. Every time I'd arrived at their house thinner and more tired. Every holiday where I brought homemade gifts because I couldn't afford bought ones anymore, while my sister showed up in new clothes and talked about her expensive hobbies. "We couldn't intervene until you were ready to see it yourself," my grandfather said. "If we'd pushed, you'd have defended them. You had to get here on your own." I spread my spreadsheets on the table next to his legal pad. Line by line, we went through everything. He asked questions in that quiet, methodical way of his. "What exactly did your mother say when she asked for the credit card? Did you authorize the limit increase? Were these charges discussed with you beforehand? Do you have any written agreement for repayment?" As we worked, he made notes. At one point, he looked up and said, "This has a name. What your family is doing. It's called financial abuse. They're using your love and your sense of obligation to subsidize their lifestyle. They're calling it family support, but it's theft dressed up in guilt and manipulation. Hearing it said out loud like that, clinical and clear, should have hurt. Instead, I felt something like relief. It wasn't just me being oversensitive. It wasn't me being selfish or ungenerous. It was real, it had a name, and other people recognized it as wrong. "What do I do?" I asked. My grandfather sat back in his chair and studied me. "That depends. What do you want?" I'd been so focused on what everyone else wanted from me that the question felt foreign. What did I want? I wanted my car back. I wanted my business to be mine again. I wanted to sleep at night without calculating which bill I could skip. I wanted to paint ornaments without wondering if the supplies I bought would be listed as a family expense in my mother's imaginary business plan. I wanted my life back. "I want it to stop," I said. "All of it. I want boundaries. I want my car. I want them to stop using my credit card. I want my business to stay my business, and I want them to understand that what they're doing is wrong." My grandfather nodded. "Then here's what we're going to do." We spent the next 3 hours building a plan. It was specific, it was clear, and it felt like putting on armor after years of walking around defenseless. First, I'd secure everything. Change passwords, cancel the credit card, close the joint account I'd opened with my mother for emergencies that had somehow become her personal slush fund. Second, I'd send a formal message demanding the return of my car, including copies of the registration and a deadline. Third, if they didn't comply, I'd report it to the police as a stolen vehicle. Fourth, we'd prepare for the fallout. "They're not going to like this," my grandfather said. "They're going to call you selfish and ungrateful. They're going to tell you that you're ruining the family. They're going to make you feel like the villain." "They already make me feel like the villain," I said. "At least this time I'll be standing up for myself while they do it." My grandmother appeared then with fresh coffee and homemade cookies that she packed into a container for me to take home. She kissed my forehead and said, "You've been carrying this alone for too long. Let us help." I left their house that morning with my documentation organized into folders, a legal plan, and something I hadn't felt in months. Hope, maybe. Or just the strength that comes from knowing you're not imagining things. Back at my apartment, I started implementing the plan immediately. First, I changed every password on every account. Email, banking, credit card, business website, cloud storage where I kept my design files. I enabled two-factor authentication on everything. Then I called the credit card company and explained that I needed to remove my mother as an authorized user and close the account. They asked if I wanted to transfer the balance to a new card. I did, because I still had to pay it off, but at least now it would stop growing. Next came the hardest part. I opened a new text message to my sister and stared at the blank screen for 10 minutes before I started typing. The message I finally sent was formal and clear. I explained that the car was registered in my name, that it was given to me specifically for my business by our grandfather, and that I needed it returned to me by Friday at 6 o'clock in the evening. I included a photo of the registration as proof. I explained that if the car was not returned by that deadline, I would report it as stolen and provide the documentation to the police. I kept emotion out of it. Just facts and consequences. I sent similar messages to my mother about the closed accounts and canceled cards. I explained that I could no longer provide financial support, that the money taken without my authorization had severely damaged my business, and that moving forward, my finances were private and off limits. I didn't apologize. I didn't explain. I just stated the new reality. Then I turned off my phone and went to work. I had a holiday market coming up that weekend, and I needed inventory. So I painted. I painted Christmas trees and snowflakes and stars and reindeer. I painted first homes and new babies and family names in careful script. I painted until my hands cramped and my back ached and my phone stayed dark and silent where I'd left it. Thursday morning, I turned my phone back on. 63 messages waited for me, mostly in the family group chat. My mother said I was being dramatic and cruel. My sister said I was overreacting and that she was just borrowing the car, not stealing it. My father sent a message that just said, "Can we all calm down and talk about this reasonably?" followed by 6 question mark emojis. My mother's sister, who I barely spoke to, had been added to the group chat and was demanding to know why I was upsetting everyone during the holidays. There were voice messages too. My mother crying about how hard things were, how she'd only been trying to help coordinate family resources, how I was making her feel like a criminal. My sister angry, asking if I was seriously going to call the police over a car that I barely used anyway. My father mediating, suggesting we all take a breath and remember that we loved each other. I read it all, absorbed it, and then I muted the group chat and didn't respond. Instead, I focused on getting ready for the market. I packed up my inventory carefully, organized my price signs, checked my change box. Without the car, I had to arrange for a friend to give me a ride and help me transport everything. It was humbling, asking for help, explaining that my family had taken my vehicle and I was in the process of getting it back. But my friend just nodded and said, "Friday at 3? I'll bring my truck." Friday afternoon arrived cold and clear. I worked until 2, then showered and changed into clean clothes. My friend picked me up at 3, and we loaded up everything I needed for the market the next morning. Then I asked if we could drive to my parents' house. "You sure you want to do this?" my friend asked. "No," I said, "but I'm doing it anyway." We arrived at 5:40, 20 minutes before my deadline. My sister's car, the one she'd bought last year with money I now suspected came from charges to my credit card that were labeled as other things, sat in the driveway. My car was nowhere in sight. I texted my sister, "I'm outside. 20 minutes until 6 o'clock. No response. At 5:55, my mother opened the front door and walked toward my friend's truck. I rolled down the window. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You're going to call the police on your own sister? Over a car?" "It's my car," I said. "I need it for my business. It needs to be returned." "She'll bring it back on Monday," my mother said. "She needs it for the weekend." "I need it for the weekend," I said. "I have a market tomorrow. It was given to me for my business. The deadline is in 5 minutes." My mother's face hardened. "You're really going to do this? You're really going to choose a car over your family?" I could feel my hands shaking, but my voice came out steady. "I'm choosing my business and my independence. You're the ones who decided to take something that wasn't yours." At 5:58, my sister came out of the house. She walked toward the truck with my car keys dangling from one finger, moving slowly like she was granting me a favor instead of returning stolen property. She tossed the keys through the open window. They hit my lap and fell onto the seat. "Happy now?" she said. "Hope your stupid ornament business is worth losing your family over." She walked back toward the house without waiting for an answer. My mother followed, casting one last disappointed look over her shoulder. The door closed, and I was left sitting in my friend's truck, holding my keys, shaking so hard I could barely breathe. "You okay?" my friend asked. "No," I said, "but I got my car back." We drove to where my sister had parked it 3 blocks away, like she'd been planning to make me walk. I checked it over carefully. My supplies were gone, the decorative seat covers I'd installed were missing, there were stains on the back seat I didn't recognize, and someone had clearly been eating in it because there were crumbs everywhere. But it was there. It was mine, and I had it back. I sat in the driver's seat alone after my friend left, forehead pressed against the steering wheel, and cried. Not pretty crying. Ugly, shaking, snot running down my face crying. I cried for the relationship I'd wanted with my family, and clearly would never have. I cried for the money I'd lost and the time I'd wasted trying to be good enough. I cried because I'd won, but it felt like losing. And then I stopped crying, wiped my face, and drove home. The holiday market that weekend was good. Not great, but good. I made enough to cover my costs and put a little extra aside. People asked about my ornaments, complimented my technique, placed orders for next year. I smiled and talked to customers and packed purchases carefully. I pretended I was fine, and by Sunday evening, the pretending felt a little more like truth. The following Tuesday, my grandfather called a family meeting. Nobody had heard from him since the car situation. Nobody knew that he'd been helping me document everything, that he had copies of statements and messages and proof of every request for money and every charge on my credit card. When he called and said we needed to talk, everyone came because when my grandfather said it was time to talk, you showed up. I arrived at my grandparents' house at 10 in the morning to find both my parents already there, sitting stiffly in the living room. My sister came in 5 minutes later, still wearing the sullen expression she'd had when she returned my keys. My grandmother served coffee and pastries that nobody touched, and then my grandfather came in with 2 manila folders. He didn't sit down. He stood at the head of the room like he was leading a business meeting, which in a way, I guess he was. He opened the first folder and began. "I'm going to walk through some numbers," he said, "and everyone is going to listen without interrupting." He went through every transaction, every request for money, every credit card charge, every time my mother had asked for help with utilities or groceries or unexpected expenses. He showed the escalation pattern, how the requests had gotten larger and more frequent. He showed my sister's social media posts dated the same days as emergency charges on my credit card, posts about expensive restaurants and shopping trips. My mother tried to interrupt 3 times. My grandfather held up his hand each time and kept going. When he finished reading the financial timeline, he pulled out printouts of the family group chat messages about reorganizing my business. He read my mother's proposal aloud, including the part where she'd suggested I should get 20% of my own work. The room got very quiet. This has a name, my grandfather said, and his voice was harder than I'd ever heard it. What you've been doing to her. It's financial abuse. You've been using her sense of obligation and her love for you to take her money, her car, her time, her business. You've been calling it family support and generosity, but what it actually is, what the law calls it, is theft. It's exploitation. It's wrong. My mother's face flushed. We were trying to help coordinate resources. We're a family. Families share. Families ask permission, my grandfather said. Families respect boundaries. Families don't add someone as an authorized user on their credit card and then charge thousands of dollars without discussion. That's not sharing. That's stealing. He looked at my sister. You took a car that was registered in your sister's name, that was given specifically for her business, and you kept it for months. When she asked for it back, you called her selfish. Do you know what that sounds like to me? Entitlement. Manipulation. My sister looked at the floor and said nothing. My grandfather turned to my father, who'd been sitting motionless through the entire presentation. And you. You saw all of this happening. You knew. Every thumbs-up emoji you sent was permission. Every time you stayed quiet, you were choosing a side. You chose their convenience over your daughter's well-being, and you thought silence would protect you from the consequences. My father opened his mouth, closed it, looked at his hands. Then my grandfather opened the second folder. I had set aside a small trust fund for family emergencies. Medical bills, unexpected job loss, genuine crises. I'd planned to tell everyone about it after I passed, something to help with transition costs and funeral expenses. But after watching how you've been defining emergency and family support, I've made some changes. He pulled out a legal document. The trust has been reorganized. A portion will still be held for genuine emergencies, with clear definitions and oversight. The remainder has been transferred to a business development fund specifically for my granddaughter's ornament business. The money is hers, controlled by her, and cannot be accessed by anyone else for any reason. My mother stood up suddenly. You can't do that. That money was for the family. All of us. I can do that, my grandfather said calmly. And I have. My money, my choice. Just like her car was her car, her credit card was her credit card, and her business is her business. These are not complicated concepts. He sat down then and looked at me for the first time since the meeting started. What do you want? He asked. What would make this right for you? I'd thought about this since the night I called him. I'd imagined this conversation 100 different ways. In some versions, I demanded full repayment. In others, I cut everyone off completely. In my angriest moments, I fantasized about public confrontation, about posting my spreadsheets online and letting everyone see what my family had done. But sitting there in my grandparents' living room, looking at my mother's defensive face and my sister's resentful silence and my father's desperate desire to disappear, I realized what I actually wanted was much simpler. I want the charges to stop immediately, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I want my finances to be private and off limits from now on. I want my car to stay my car, my business to stay my business, my life to be respected as mine. And I want a payment plan to compensate for some of what was taken without my permission. We can't afford a payment plan, my mother said immediately. You could afford restaurants and marketing consultants and shopping trips, I said. You can afford $100 a month. That won't even cover half of what you took, but it's something. And it acknowledges that what happened was wrong. My sister finally looked up. What if we say no? Then I take this documentation to a lawyer, I said. And we find out what a judge thinks about unauthorized credit card use and financial exploitation of family members. Your choice. The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Everything could have broken completely in that moment. Instead, my mother signed a paper my grandfather had prepared, acknowledging the debt and agreeing to monthly payments. My sister signed too, though she did it without looking at me. My father signed last, his signature shaky and small. That should have been the end of it. Dramatic confrontation, signed agreements, everyone goes home and rebuilds from here. But life doesn't work in neat story arcs. And families are complicated even when you think you've drawn clear boundaries. The payments came for 3 months. $100, transferred on the first of each month like clockwork. Then February passed with nothing. March came and went. April arrived empty-handed. I could have chased them, could have sent reminders, called my grandfather, threatened legal action. But sitting in my new workshop space, the one I'd rented with money from the trust fund, I realized something. I didn't want the money. I'd never really wanted the money. What I'd wanted was acknowledgement, respect, some sign that they understood what they'd done was wrong. I'd gotten the acknowledgement in that meeting. The signature on that paper, even if the payment stopped, was proof that they knew, proof that someone else saw it and agreed it was wrong. That was enough. I focused on my business instead. The trust fund had given me options I'd never had before. I rented a small studio space with big windows and good light. The location was perfect, right in the arts district where tourists wandered on weekends. I set up my painting station in the front window where people could watch me work. I hired a teenager from the neighborhood to help with prep work and packaging 3 afternoons a week. In April, the local newspaper did a story about small businesses in the arts district. The photographer came on a day when I was painting a custom order, and he captured my hands mid-brush stroke, permanently silver from years of metallic paint that never quite washed out completely. The article called me an artisan, called my work unique and personal, called my business thriving. I hung the article on my workshop wall and looked at it sometimes when I needed reminding that I'd built something real. My father started showing up in May. Not regularly, not dramatically, just occasionally. He'd walk into the shop when I was painting, browse the displays like a customer, eventually buy something. He always paid in cash, always chose the most expensive ornaments. He'd hand me the money without meeting my eyes and mumble something about sending it to a cousin for their new baby or a friend who was moving. Maybe he was telling the truth. Maybe he was just trying to funnel money to me in a way that didn't require him to admit he was trying to make amends. Either way, I accepted the cash and thanked him for his purchase and pretended we were just shopkeeper and customer. One afternoon in June, while I was wrapping up a set of ornaments he'd bought, he cleared his throat. "I should have said something," he said to the counter. Not to me, to the counter. "When it was happening, I should have stood up for you." I finished tying the ribbon around the box before I answered. "Yes, you should have." "I was trying to keep the peace," he said. "You were trying to avoid conflict," I said. "Those aren't the same thing." He nodded slowly, picked up his package, and left. But he came back 2 weeks later and bought more ornaments, and 2 weeks after that, and again in July. I didn't forgive him exactly, but I didn't turn him away either. What we had wasn't a relationship, but it wasn't nothing. It was something small and careful being built in the space where silence used to live. My sister came into the shop once in August. I was in the middle of helping another customer, and I saw her walk in out of the corner of my eye. She browsed the displays, picked up ornaments, put them down again. She watched me work for a while, saw me laugh with my teenage assistant, saw the workshop that was actually thriving. When the other customer left, my sister came to the counter with 3 ornaments in her hands. She paid the full price without asking for a discount, without mentioning that we were family, without expecting special treatment. "These are good," she said, wrapping her purchases carefully in the tissue paper I provided. "Really good." "Thank you," I said. She paused at the door. "I'm sorry," she said. Not elaborate, not explaining, just those 2 words. "I know," I said. She left and didn't come back. But I kept the receipt from that sale, folded it carefully, put it in the drawer where I kept important documents. Sometimes sorry doesn't fix things, but it still matters that it was said. My mother never came to the shop. The payments never resumed. We didn't speak for months, and when we finally did, at my grandmother's birthday dinner in September, it was polite and distant. She asked how business was doing. I said it was going well. She commented that my sister's influencer career was really taking off now. I said that was nice. We ate cake and made small talk and hugged goodbye like acquaintances instead of mother and daughter. Maybe someday we'd rebuild something real. Maybe we wouldn't. I'd stop trying to predict or control it. What I'd learned was that I could survive without their approval, could build a life without their support, could be happy without their validation. That knowledge sat different in my chest than the desperate need to fix things that I used to carry around. On December 1st, I looked at my calendar and realized it had been a year since that night in my workshop when I'd finally faced the truth. A year since the spreadsheet, since the call to my grandfather, since I'd started taking my life back piece by piece. My business had grown. I had contracts with 3 local boutiques to sell my ornaments year-round, not just at Christmas. I'd started teaching weekend workshops, showing other artists my techniques. My teenage assistant was talking about art school, and I was writing her a recommendation letter. I'd hired an accountant to help manage my taxes and keep my finances organized. I'd opened a retirement account. I had health insurance. I slept in a bed instead of on the workshop floor. I painted an ornament for myself that December, something I rarely did. A simple design, just a silver tree on a white background, with the date painted in careful script. I didn't hang it on a tree because I didn't have a tree that year. I hung it on the wall of my workshop, next to the newspaper article and the receipt from my sister's purchase, and the first dollar I'd earned after getting my car back. These were my markers, my reminders. My proof that I'd survived something that could have destroyed me and had come out the other side with a business, a purpose, and a life that was finally completely mine. My grandfather came by the workshop one afternoon in mid-December. He wandered around looking at my displays, picked up ornaments, and examined them closely, asked questions about my process. When he was ready to leave, he stopped at the door. "I'm proud of you," he said. "Not just for the business, for standing up, for knowing when enough was enough, for being strong enough to choose yourself." I hugged him tight. This man who'd given me a car and a trust fund and his unflinching support when I needed it most. "Thank you," I said, "for seeing what was happening, for helping me see it too, for not giving up on me." "Never," he said. "You're an artisan, and artisans need reliable wheels, good tools, and people who believe in their work." After he left, I stood in my workshop with my inventory and my employee schedule and my business plan for the next year. I thought about the girl who'd stood in her grandparents' driveway 2 years ago, unable to explain where her car was. The girl who'd said yes to everything because saying no felt impossible. The girl who'd believed that love meant giving until there was nothing left to give. That girl was gone. In her place was someone harder and softer at the same time. Someone who knew the difference between generosity and exploitation. Someone who could say no without guilt, who could set boundaries without apology, who could build something beautiful with her own 2 hands and not feel obligated to share it with people who only wanted to take. I'd lost a family dynamic I'd thought I needed, but I'd gained myself back. My independence, my business, my peace, my future. And every time I looked at my permanently silver hands, I remembered that some marks aren't damage. They're proof that you showed up, did the work, and became exactly who you were meant to be. That was enough. I was enough. And my life, this small, beautiful life I'd built from scratch and defended with everything I had, was finally and completely mine.